The year was 1975 and the date September 27 when Peter Proud attempted to wipe out any of his memories of the days when he was known by the name of Jeff Curtis. He had gone to Springfield. Mom met his murderer and his daughter. Their lives had been destroyed as his had been taken. Once, Peter had tried to complete the story, when Marcia had murdered him once more at the same location but this time by gun. Marcia was now in her late 50s but she had found him and taken his life after finding out he was the reincarnation of her dead husband. Peter had met his daughter from his prior life and had made love to her. It was something that Marcia just couldn't forgive. As she brought the small boat to the landing she thought about what she had done. Had she brought the wrath of Jeff to her again? She was sure that he would never let her go. Anne called and called Peter but got no answer. Also, where was her mother? Her mother had left the country club so abruptly and had refused to open the door for her. After wringing her hands and waiting for what seemed hours, Anne headed over to the hotel where Peter was staying. She went up to his room and knocked, but there was no answer. As she spoke to the hotel clerk he told her that Peter had left the hotel hours ago. At this point Anne went to her car and put her head on the steering wheel. The cottage, that is where she was sure that she would find her mother. With that she turned on the car and sped towards what would turn out to be her most fateful moment in her life. Peter's friend Dr. Sam Goodwin was feeling bad for himself and found himself very worried about his friend Peter. He knew that if everything that Peter had told him was true there was a possibility that Peter could be in real danger. Although he had been headed to the airport, he decided to turn around. He was heading to Crystal Lake to once again try to stop Peter from going into the lake. As Sam pulled into the cottage, he saw Anne getting out of her car. He introduced himself and the two of them started looking for signs that Marcia or Peter had been there. As they approached the door, they saw that it was not locked. Just as they started to go inside they heard the motorboat sound and turned toward the lake. There they saw Marcia in an extreme state of distress. She was holding a pistol and blabbering incoherently. Both Anne and Sam's world crashed that day. Both Anne and Sam's world changed that day. Anne because she lost her mom to a mental breakdown and her boyfriend. Sam lost his friend and his best money maker that he had ever imagined. Yes, fame and fortune had slipped through his fingers. Sam decided that it was time to go back to Springfield, Mass once again and see if he could put his friend's soul to rest. He took the next plane to Bradley Airport in Connecticut and headed out in a rented automobile and headed out to Springfield. To say he had no idea what he was going to find was an understatement. He no longer had a can-be-reached number for Anne, and with Dell phones no one had a phone at home anymore, so he decided to head up to the house where Anne had once lived. Court was awful and Anne had to listen to how the man she had fallen in love with was the reincarnation of her father, and then listen to the doctors when they said that her mother was going to need years of therapy. It wasn't until nearly 3 months later that Anne realized that she was pregnant. Pregnant with the reincarnation of her father's child. Oh, the headlines that would make, she thought. So, she went to a New York doctor under another name and hid her pregnancy. 6 months after Anne's mother had been sent to a mental home, Anne gave birth to a baby boy. He looked so much like Peter and she hoped that life would be better for him. Anne made up her mind that there would be no drinking and no mention of who her baby's father was. 2 days later Anne gave him up for adoption. Sam had been at the trial when the verdict had come. As a witness he was not allowed in the courtroom during the trial and had to depend on the newspapers for most of his information. Anne had refused to speak to him about anything. For both Anne and Sam life had gone on. Anne had never married, but had made herself known for her kindness and hard work involving people with drug and alcohol problems brought on by a mental health condition. Just 10 years later she had lost her mom who had never fully recovered from her breakdown. Just 6 months after the ordeal in court Sam and his wife Jean had adopted a little boy they named Joseph. Joseph was the apple of Sam's eye even though he had no idea who Joseph's real parents were. Joseph grew into a strong young man who was very athletic and very good at the game of tennis. He was working as a semi-pro when he had taken a job teaching at a local high school. On the day of his 32nd birthday Joe started having dreams, or should they be called nightmares. As he spoke to his father on the phone Joe knew that his cool-headed father was rattled. Sam couldn't believe his ears. His son was describing the nightmare that Peter Proud had revealed to him some 33 years ago. Was this Peter coming back or Jeff? He had to know. Sam found himself in a state of shock and immediately made the decision that he was going to head to Springfield, find Anne and see if he and Anne could put an end to the nightmare and put Peter's soul to rest. He did not have a phone number, and with everyone having cell phones now, no one had a home phone anymore. So as he got off the plane, he rented a car and headed to Springfield, Massachusetts. As he drove towards the house, he thought of what he would say if he did find Anne. She had to know, and he had to know if she had a son that she had given up for was just pulling up to the driveway of Anne's old house when she saw someone walking towards her car. He couldn't believe his luck, it was Anne. Joseph was being bothered by these two dreams, one from about 75 years ago and one from about 40 years ago where he was murdered while swimming. He was waking up in cold sweats every morning and his poor wife was going crazy. When he called to his parents' house, he was surprised to hear that his father had made an emergency tree connect-a-cut and that he was on his way to Springfield, Massachusetts. That is when Joseph got on the computer and began looking at pictures of Springfield. It was the town that kept on coming up in his dreams. He was sure of that. He had to know. With that, he took the first flight out to Bradley Airport. He wanted to know what was going on. Anne and Sam had a long talk, and Sam didn't find himself surprised that she had given up a son just about exactly the same time he had adopted Joe. Something told him that this was how Peter had planned it in the first place. When Sam's phone rang and he saw that Joe was calling, he and Anne both knew that something was going on. Sam told Joe how to get to her house, and there they met in the living room. Joe sat there in awe, listening to the story of what had happened to the two men and what the man called Peter Proud had once been sure was the truth. It was the darndest story that he had ever heard, but his dreams mirrored what he was being told. The lady seemed to be very sure of the facts. And this was his birth mother. She was very pretty and educated. He had so many questions that he wanted to ask her. But first he wanted to help himself get rid of these dreams. It was decided that the best action would be to have Joe return and swim the lake. He was athletic and a good swimmer, so he agreed. Anne and Sam went to the other side to wait for him to return. They waited and waited, but it seemed as though all hope was lost, as it had now been hours. But Anne said wait, and they did. From the bottom of the sea, the man who had once been both Peter Proud and Jeff Curtis woke up to a light. It was a strong light that drew them to the top of the water. There in the water was a man swimming. Both men, realizing that they had someone to enter, did so, and the one man became all of them as it was to be. But Peter and Jeff went to the back this time, or did they? Will they return once again? Finally, Joe appeared to Anne and Sam and climbed out of the water. There was something different about the man. He seemed to be at peace and not so tortured as he did before. With that, Joe went home never to suffer another dream. For Sam and Anne, they decided to write a book about their experience. It became a bestseller for weeks. But Anne never married, as she knew the man she wanted was Peter Proud.